Women, peace, and security has been an evolving field over the past 5 decades on a national and international level. Global conferences led by the United Nations to specifically discuss women and their role in society started in the 1970s, and by the 1990s, critical concerns were finally raised in regards to conflict and women and their perspective and experience. Due to the changing war context, displaced people, protracted wars, and areas that depend on foreign troops to function, there's been a dire need to change the way conflict is assessed and prevented, and how peace is to be negotiated in the long term. In creating this more sustainable version of equality, justice, and peace in our world, women have come up as a key solution many times. These global conferences analyzed how women and men are affected differently in conflict, the vulnerability of women and children, especially in armed conflict, and the ability that women have to bring a different viewpoint to the table that as a global society we have not been engaging with, and allowing women to discuss conflict prevention, resolution, and reintegration processes for societies to thrive. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, that came out as a product of these global conferences, was released in 2000 and has been a starting block for action domestically in the U.S. and globally in regards to the inclusion and participation of women in peace building and keeping. From a United States military perspective, the 1990 Gulf War serves as an example of an instance where long-term peace was not accomplished after the conflict was over in Iraq, and how the absence of women in this military operation is a lesson to learn from in military strategy planning, and the future dynamic of these operations and the way the U.S. engages and plans to respond to future conflicts. Women, peace, and security as a field was created due to the lack of inclusion of women in the efforts of peace and security. Women are an essential part of the equation in both of these areas, as they represent half of the world population, and are therefore exposed to conflict and issues of security. Their experiences are different than men, especially in times of conflict, as women are concluded to be more vulnerable than men, which creates a difference in perspective that is completely being ignored when women, half of the population, are not being included in talks of conflict prevention and long-standing peace efforts. In the latter 2 decades of the 20th century, women began to mobilize in their efforts to show that they had a voice in society, and women's movements grew at a rapid rate internationally as they demanded to have equal rights and equal opportunity to be heard. Therefore, the initial force behind the WPS initiatives and the onset of the 21st century rose out of the reality that all people in a society are affected by conflict, yet only one gender, that being male, is at the table to decide the best course of action to take. Internationally, the United Nations took the first step in the direction of invoking the inclusion and protection of women through Security Council resolutions that have continued throughout the past 2 decades. This has caused a trickle-down effect to many governments around the world who have adopted their own policies and initiatives in regards to WPS. The United States specifically has added WPS to their National Action Plan, and objectives on how to create space for women to have a critical role in peace negotiations and building peace, and access to these spaces has been adopted by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and USAID governmental agencies. The way these government actors have revised their existing structures and included in their plans to promote and allow the participation of women is especially relevant in the structure of the United States Army. In analyzing a timeline of WPS initiatives, it's really important to recognize how recently this topic has really come into the political scheme on a national and international level. In 1975, the UN started to host conferences in which there would be a series of 4 on gender equality, and this was in lieu of the changing war context, the number of displaced peoples in conflict areas, as well as protracted wars. In December of 1979, there was a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW, which is an international bill of rights for women, consisting of a preamble and 30 articles. This UN treaty defines what constitutes discrimination against women and sets up an agenda for national action to end such discrimination. The most significant of these 4 UN conferences was the 1995 Beijing Declaration, which was the Fourth World Conference on Women. During this conference, it was very clear that there was an objective to promote the role of women in peacemaking. And in this declaration, 20 critical areas of concern necessary to create greater equality and opportunities for women and men were outlined. The start of the 21st century brought a series of resolutions started by the United Nations Security Council that focused specifically on the topic of women, peace, and security. In 2000, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security outlined 4 pillars of participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery for women in conflict and peace building. Additionally, in 2000, the UN released their Millennium Development Goals, which explicitly included gender equality as one of these goals. Later in 2005 was the first National Action Plan on WPS in the United States, which outlined how to advance national efforts to increase women's participation in security processes and improve women's protection from threats to violence. Between 2000 and 2019, 10 additional Security Council resolutions have been written up in relation to women's rights and equality, also including the topic of gender-based violence. Most recently, in June of 2020, the Department of State, Department of Defense, USAID, Department of Homeland Security have all released revised WPS implementation plans. The relevance of the 1990 Gulf War and WPS initiatives and how the absence of women in certain roles, especially on the ground during peace negotiations, is an example of a military event in which women could have been advantageous to more long-standing and productive peace negotiations. In analyzing the 1990 Gulf War, it's important to look at the actual information about Iraq during this time in order to understand how the pre-war conditions and the post-war conditions can be comparable to show the ineffectiveness of creating long-standing peace on the ground in Iraq. Pre-war Iraq in 1968, the government at the time was the Ba'ath Party. Women had an essential role during this time in achieving goals to consolidate the power of the government and achieve a quick growth in the economy. Therefore, pre-war Iraq needed females to be a part of creating a more politically and economically stable country. There were laws enacted to improve the status of women as they were seen as interconnected with the government's political and economic goals. Iraqi women, up until 1990, had an active role in this political and economic development. Created during this time was the General Federation of Iraqi Women, a group running rural and urban community centers to help women have access to educational, career, and social programs that also assisted in pushing for legal reforms that advanced the status of women under the law. The law at this time read, "The primary legal underpinning of women's equality is contained in the Iraqi Provisional Constitution, which was drafted by the Ba'ath Party in 1970. Article 19 declares all citizens equal before the law regardless of sex, blood, language, social origin, or religion." In January 1971, Iraq also ratified the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, would provide equal protection under international law to all. Under Iraqi law, there were a few different components that helped to improve Iraqi society and included women. Compulsory law that both sexes attend primary school. Eradication of illiteracy, which would lead to literacy classes for young adults, and narrow the illiteracy gap between genders. A law on labor and employment to allow women equal access, increasing the number of women in the workforce, and breaking down the traditional norm of women remaining in the home. During the Iraq-Iran War, many women entered the workforce between 1980 and 1988. Until 1990, women in the workforce continued to grow. Personal status laws. In 1978, divorced mothers had custody of children, and there were conditions put into place under which a woman could seek divorce. This was all part of the process to modernize Iraq's society. giving women the right to vote and run for office in 1980. And in 1986, Iraq became one of the first to ratify the CEDAW. All of this information is really relevant to how Iraq looked going into the 1990 Gulf War, and the role of women in society and their increasing role in the 1960s leading up until the 1990s. The conditions of the United States military at the time of the 1990 Gulf War are especially relevant to the lack of inclusion of women in the ground and the effects of that. During this time, the U.S. law forbade women from serving in combat roles, which kept them out of military positions designed specifically for combat. During this time, there were also many censuses that allowed people to give public opinion about going to war in Iraq. The results of this were about 50-50, with half of the U.S. population wanting to continue sanctions and find a peaceful solution, and the other half wanting to go to war. For the female population, almost 100% of female thought that pursuing sanctions and continuing to find a peaceful way to negotiate with Iraq was the best option. There were 3 options at this time, which were to withdraw, wait out sanctions, or initiate war. When there was the decision made to initiate war, the attacks were justified due to the political demise of Hussein at the time. Women during this time in the United States mostly expressed mild opposition or ambivalence, whereas men typically showed the stronger support for war. The government began to consider the issue of women in combat after 1990, after not including them in this war with Iraq. The consequences of the Gulf War in Iraq dramatically affected the Iraqi female population, causing a backtrack in the country in terms of female access to education and job opportunities, as well as social and political rights. This aftermath shows how important peace negotiating is in areas of conflict, as the United States missed an opportunity in Iraq to help provide a more stable society by communicating and working with local leaders and having conversations surrounding the current conditions in Iraq that led to civil unrest and instability, which could have been helped when including women's roles and their inability to have a voice at the negotiating table during this conflict. Some examples of how post-Gulf War Iraq looked include the following. The 1990 Gulf War reversed the Ba'ath administration under Hussein. UN sanctions had a disproportionate effect on women and girls. There became a gender gap in school, as there was an inability to send children to school. In 1987, 75% of Iraqi women were literate. In 2000, that dropped to being less than 25%, as women had less access to the education system after the 1990 Gulf War. There were restrictions put in place on the freedom of mobility and protection under the law for females. And this time also pushed women out of the workforce, as they were reversed back to traditional roles of staying in the house. There was a study done called Operational Gender Assessment, which analyzed the impact of gender roles in Iraq, and also discussed the Combined Joint Task Force, Operation Inherent Resolve, CJTF-OIR, to integrate gender perspectives and knowledge in the planning, execution, and assessment of strategies. This was used to understand the character of domain, socially constructed roles, behaviors, attributes for men, women, and the role of gender. The CJTF-OIR had gender goals in Iraq, which included educating ISF on gender issues, educating the CGTF on gender issues in Iraq, the training of police and military linked to the training of local police, increasing female participation in the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense, supporting ISF on gender mainstreaming, and routinely considering incorporating gender considerations into operational planning, conduct, and assessments. Operational gender assessment also analyzed the background to Iraq society. This included the goal of women to restore women to their pre-conflict norms of being complementary of men, able to work and in charge of their homes. After the fall of Hussein, impoverished men reverted to the traditional structures of Islam, which limited women's job opportunities, increased tensions in the home, making it unsafe for females to travel, and provided a lack of security and education of women, and decreased many females' confidence. The ISIS occupation at the time also limited women's opportunity and ability to move around in their society, to work, and be educated. The government of Iraq changed in their vision of women's roles in society from 1970 to post-1990 Gulf War. In 1970, the Iraq Provisional Constitution assured equal rights to women, including the right to vote, run for police office, own property, and attend school. Following the end of the Gulf War in 1991, women's position in society deteriorated due to influence of conservative religious and tribal groups. After a history of having been the first Arab country to elect women to parliamentary positions and having a capacity of 25% filled by females, there was a sudden resistance to democracy, bannering women, as well as the legislation that was in place having difficulty being passed due to Islamic restrictions. There were also a handful of policies put in place around the suppression of women and their rights. Women needed a male representative in order to divorce, and they made it difficult for females to inherit any money or property when leaving a divorce. There was also a rise in beatings and domestic violence as males became to assume a role of dominance and authority, and there was no legality behind charging for domestic violence, which led to perpetual violence against women and thus a normalized violence in Iraqi society. Women had a limit to economic choices as they were unable to obtain jobs. They also were withheld from being able to move freely in public spaces and being allowed to drive. And they were constrained as they needed to move with a male. And there was issues for female heads of households. Some other key points about Iraqi society include cultural norms around gender stereotypes, such as the belief that women should be subservient, and women were not seen as capable as men. Additionally, there was much social stratification, and classes were chosen by the government. During this time, the middle class deteriorated, and there was the rise of kin groups, which were social units, and family loyalty were essential. The religion in Iraq was 95% Islam, with not a separate church and state, with 51% being Shias or Shiites and 42% being Sunnis, with a small percentage of Christians and Yazidis. The employment during the Iraq-Iran War of 1980 to 88, men left to fight, so women stepped up to fill positions. In 2000, there was an increase in restricting women working outside of the home. The freedom of their travel was limited, and there was single-sex education, only allowing males to attend school. The Hussein government of 2003 downgraded women to traditional conservative norms and led women to have trouble finding jobs and have lower education levels, skills, and lack of working skills, which led the lack of education and awareness of rights limited women's empowerment and employment opportunities. Another key point to recognize is the participation of women in Iraqi society. Some gender participation considerations, thus being barriers to women's participation in the workplace, include female insecurity, which is an obstacle to women's political engagements many of times. Additionally, there are social and cultural barriers, as Iraq is a patriarchal society, and discourage women from participating in many different roles. Peace building in Iraq relies on tribal hierarchy, which inherently restricts female involvement. Therefore, there is a necessity to shift the mindset of Iraqi society to advance women's role in peace building, and a key to this is education. Though economic participation by women is law, there is an issue with home-based spousal acceptance, as women are seen to not be as effective in the home if they are working outside of the home. Therefore, keeping them home is their first responsibility. Additionally, there are many societal views and perceptions that women are the followers of men, therefore not as capable as men, as they are childbearing. Furthermore, there are additional drawbacks, as females at the time are achieving a lower level of education, have lack of labor skills, therefore low participation in the workforce. Finally, there are issues of security, as there is unsafe and unreliable transportation, and women suffer from physical and verbal abuses. Operational gender assessment also notes the initiatives that increase the inclusion of women in security forces. Some examples include increased female representation in ISF to benefit the larger community, media campaigns to educate the local population of benefits of having female police officers to investigate domestic violence, child abuse, trafficking. Another example is training and development to increase the participation of females. The curriculum of training academies needed to be improved and changed. Also, the extent of leadership commitment to gender equality in the government and supporting the Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense in achieving these gender equality goals. The 1990 Gulf War is an example of a military operation that excluded women for serving in combat roles, and in hindsight led the United States to miss an opportunity to create sustainable peace in Iraq. The conversations and studies done surrounding the impacts of female inclusion in prevention of conflict and peace building have many advantages that have been discovered in allowing their participation, especially in societies such as Iraq that have more distinct roles for males and females. And U.S. male military officers have limited to no access to holding conversations with females or girls. Therefore, Operation Desert Storm is a catalyst in the discussions surrounding women, peace, and security that have been evolving over the past 3 decades. In looking at the legislation and acts that have been put into place by governmental agencies, as well as actual participation of women in peace building and peacekeeping, highlights the advantages women have in this field and the need for more genuine efforts for their inclusion in these positions and operations. The Department of Defense has been a part of the U.S. government that has dedicated itself to incorporating women, peace, and security initiatives into their objectives. In 2020, they released the most current and revised version of their WPS implementation strategy, which include 3 main objectives as well as 4 intermediate defense objectives. The first Department of Defense objective reads, "The Department of Defense exemplifies a diverse organization that allows for women's meaningful participation across the development, management, and employment of the joint force." Objective 2 reads, "Women in partner nations meaningfully participate and serve at all ranks and in all occupations in defense and security sectors." Objective 3, partner nation defense and security ensure women and girls are safe and secure and that their human rights are protected, especially during conflict and crisis. Therefore, these main 3 objectives of the Department of Defense specifically pertain to gender equality, the inclusion of females in peace, as well as protecting females. The 4 intermediate defense objectives are 1.1 reads, "Department of Defense recruitment, development, retention, and promotion efforts are informed by WPS initiatives to ensure a diverse and inclusive fighting force." Intermediate Defense Objective 1.2 reads, "WPS principles are appropriately reflected in relevant DoD policies, plans, doctrines, training, education, operations, resource planning, and exercise." Intermediate Defense Objective 2.1 reads, "DoD supports women's meaningful participation within partner nations' defense and security sectors." And Intermediate Defense Objective 3.1 reads, "The Department of Defense works with partner nation defense and security sectors to help strengthen their understanding of and commitment to international humanitarian law and international human rights law." These objectives show just how relevant women, peace, and security is in military operation planning and how important it is to the security of the United States as well as other countries in creating long-standing peace. A main question is, why? Why is women's participation necessary in conflict prevention? One of the first ways to answer this question is looking at the current global security issues, and as they are now rendering new strategies for peacemaking. Some of these include recurrent and emerging armed conflicts in nations, expanded terrorist and extremist networks, the increased targeting of civilians, as well as mass displacement. Prior peacemaking efforts have proven ineffective, as around half of conflict resolution agreements made during the 1990s failed within 5 years. The recidivism for civil war is very high, as 90% of civil wars in the 2000s occurred in countries that have already experienced civil war during the recent 3 decades, showing an ineffectiveness of initial peace efforts. A critical strategy now to reduce conflict is to include women. Women's participation is proven to advance security interest, as their inclusion in peace negotiations make the agreements 64% less likely to fail and 35% more likely to last at least 15 years, according to recent studies. And gender equality is also associated with the lower likeliness for conflict within a society. However, the representation of women in peace and security processes is not high enough. Between 1992 and 2011, less than 4% of signatories were women in peace agreements, and 9% of negotiators were females. In 2015, the percentage of UN military peacekeepers that were female was the equivalent of 3%, and there were 10% female UN military police personnel. Women's inclusion should have a higher place on the U.S. foreign policy agenda, and more action is needed still to achieve these goals, beyond just the outlines of WPS implementation plans. Examples of administration goals to improve sustainability of peace agreements and respond effectively to security threats require women's representation and meaningful participation in conflict resolution and post-conflict processes. Governments should increase investments in efforts that promote women's inclusion. There should be a reform to U.S. diplomatic and security practices to incorporate the experiences of women in conflict-affected areas. There needs to be an improvement in staffing and coordination to deliver on government commitments. And the government must strengthen training on incorporating women in security efforts and promoting accountability of the department's specific implementation plans. The past 2 decades have shown a strong case for women's participation in security efforts, and specifically prove how these security efforts are more successful when women contribute to prevention and early warning, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and post-conflict resolution and rebuilding. In the prevention and early warning stage, it is shown that women can improve the success of conflict prevention and early warning strategies, as women have a unique vantage point. As in most societies, women have central roles in families and communities. An example of this is in Kosovo, where women were the first in this community to notice and voice concern when young men were amassing weapons and training, as there were no adequate reporting systems to make use of these insights. The conflict continued and the women's notes were ignored. It has also been shown that incorporating women in strategies to counter violent extremism can help to mitigate radicalization, as women are often the first targets of fundamentalists. They are extremely more likely to be early victims. Therefore, anti-terrorism messages effectively distributed throughout communities by women have a large influence among youth populations. Also, integrating women into anti-terrorism strategies, i.e. Sisters Against Violent Extremism Global Initiative, which is a woman-centered anti-extremism platform and training program in Europe, proves to be essential to the de-escalation of extremist efforts. In the USAID 2016 strategy to counter extremism, it was recognized that women's groups are an important source to identify and address sources of violent extremism within their communities. Women's Situation Rooms are innovative, real-time groups convened around election cycles, to anticipate and combat electoral violence, allow women in populations at risk of conflict to contribute to prevention efforts by documenting grievances, resolving community-level disputes, and reporting an electoral defense. An example of this is in the Kenya 2013 election, where women's leaders assisted Kenyan leaders in creating a system where trained election observers addressed over 500 registered complaints and relayed info to Electoral Commission and police, which later helped to de-escalate tensions, which is extremely relevant considering the 2007 general election in Kenya. There were 1,300 deaths and thousands displaced due to tensions during the election process. Women have also been proven to have a role in the peacemaking process, as their participation in formal peace processes contribute to achievement and longevity of peace agreements. Since the 1990 review of peace and constitution drafting negotiations, parties significantly were more likely to agree to talks and reach an agreement when women's groups had a strong influence in the negotiation process. Additionally, women's participation increases the likelihood of an agreement because women often take a collaborative approach to peacemaking and organize across cultural and sectarian divides. This approach includes the concern of diverse demographics affected by a conflict and increases the prospects of long-term stability and reduces likelihood of state failure, poverty, and conflict. Women have been documented on multiple occasions to build coalitions across ethnic, religious, and sectarian divides. Another point is that women are often viewed as honest brokers by negotiating parties. This is rooted in the reality of women's exclusion, as women have often had to operate outside existing power structures and generally do not control fighting forces. Therefore, they are widely perceived as politically impartial mediators in peace negotiations. Countries, including Northern Ireland and South Africa, have shown the ability of females to be trustworthy negotiators, as they build trust, communicate, involve all sides, and settle disputes, and encourage parties to negotiate and compromise. They are proven to be reliable peace brokers. In the 40 peace processes since 1990, no women's group has sought to derail a peace process. Women have also been shown to use visible and high-profile tactics, such as mass actions and the mobilization of public opinion, like pressure tactics, such as human walls, fasts, and these women's groups have organized more mass action campaigns in support of peace deals than any other social group. Women have also been shown to ensure diversity at the negotiating table, which provides a wide variety of perspective that can advance conflict resolution. Furthermore, women have different social roles and responsibilities than men, which means women have access to different information and community networks that males do not have access to. Another important point is that women's inclusion in conflict resolution processes also increases the chance that peace agreements will address the needs of vulnerable groups in post-conflict situations. An example of this is promoting reconciliations. Women are more likely to advocate for accountability and services for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. It is shown that women's inclusion is essential, as there has been a lack of women present in peace processes up until this day, as 4% of signatories in peace processes and agreements have been female, 9% have been negotiators, and it has been disproportionately male in all of these situations. It ignores their demonstrated effectiveness and overlooks a critical strategy to advance peace and stability. The failure to refer to women or their conflict experiences, which was slightly improved due to UNSCR 1325 in 2000, where afterwards 27% of agreements signed between 2000 and 2014 reference women, though only a handful include more than one provision addressing the concerns and priorities of women, and few have seriously been implemented. There is also a strong case to be made for women's inclusion in the peacekeeping process, as women make unique and substantial contributions that improve the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations. Women peacekeepers are also able to perform the same roles as male counterparts. Women actually often gain access to information that males cannot obtain. Female security sector officials have access to population in venues that are closed to men, which gives them an opportunity to gather more intelligence. It is also shown that women are better able to respond to concern about women's physical safety and are more likely to report instances of gender-based violence or conflict towards female officers. Female presence in the security sector improves dispute resolution, as women are less likely than males to use force and more likely to de-escalate tensions in a more peaceful manner. Women also strive in their goals to help to build trust within the communities that they serve, which advances stability and the rule of law. Female officers have been shown to have fewer misconduct complaints, as well as they have improved citizen perceptions of force integrity. Women are also the catalyst to empowering women and girls in host communities. However, they are routinely underrepresented. In 2015, 4% of military peacekeepers were reported to be women and 10% of police personnel. Women's importance in security efforts shows so clearly in post-conflict recovery and rebuilding. Women have been shown to ensure diversity in post-conflict recovery and rebuilding processes that have proven to advance stability. The delivering of peace agreements were more effective when women participated in their creation. And women in communities have been shown to be central figures to aiding in the reintegration process post-conflict. Women are more likely to direct post-conflict resources to the reconstruction of public institutions and the provision of service critical to stability. Moreover, high levels of women in public sector positions can improve quality of service delivery for the entire community. The most important of these points is that the strengthening of women's political and social participation after conflict in societies diminish the chance of collapse and relapse. The risk of conflict collapse was near zero when women made up at least 35% of legislature, as shown in conflicts between 1980 and 2003. Additionally, there was a lower risk of civil war onset, and there was a reduced likelihood of state-perpetuated political violence. A final point is that countries are more stable and prosperous as the gender gap closes across a range of areas, including education, healthcare, political participation, and economic participation. The most rapid post-conflict reduction in poverty was observed in areas where women reported higher levels of female empowerment. There are a handful of countries to show examples of women in peace processes and their effectiveness. One example is Guatemala in 1996. In 1996, the peace accords in Guatemala ended a 36-year civil war between the government and the leftist insurgents. In order to come to these peace accords, there was a civil society assembly, which included civil society organizations, including women's groups, to be involved in the peace processes and address issues typically overlooked. Public participation in the process led to the inclusion of almost 200 distinct commitments on social, economic, and political reforms in the accords. Most of these reforms were introduced and led by women in the civil society assembly's women's sector. On women's agenda during this time, there was land tenure reform, social justice, and the establishment of the Office of the Defense of Indigenous Women, which addressed issues for rural Guatemalans that have ignited the conflict and overall made the agreements more sustainable. Women promoted stability during this time by campaigning for disarmament and developing strategies to help former fighters transition to a new career. The inclusion of women in the peace process allowed greater access to the community, which helped to address structural roots to the conflict, such as community instability in the rural areas of Guatemala. Their perspective also helped because they were able to access these communities during the process to identify the needs of community members and voice these opinions on the negotiating table, therefore allowing them to have actions that would be more sustainable as they were speaking for the whole of the community. Another example is in Northern Ireland in 1998. In 1997, there were peace talks to resolve the conflict between Irish Catholic nationalists and British Protestant Unionists. Women's groups were allowed formal access to the talks due to the 1996 electoral system that allowed 2 slots for these negotiators, who became Monica Williams, an Irish Catholic, and May Blood, a British Protestant. During this time, the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition was formed to gather support from women across religious lines and brought a unique perspective to the negotiations. Speaking to people across religious borders gave a human face to the conflict and highlighted the personal conflict and consequences of war for both sides. This women's coalition gained the reputation as an honest broker that could facilitate dialogue between parties. Their contributions secured the language in the Good Friday Agreement, as they referenced victims' rights and pushed for reintegration of political prisoners, education, and mixed housing between Protestants and Catholics. The women involved in these peace talks spoke on behalf of the people and could include a diverse perspective as they spoke to people on all sides of the conflict. Their judgments from these talks were then unbiased, as they were guided by aiming to achieve peace from all parties involved. This allowed space for social cohesion during the post-conflict period and allowed for more sustainable peace. Another example of women in the peace process occurred in 2003 in Liberia. Amidst armed violence and displacement following the 1989 coup, many women and girls were victims of sexual violence, abductions, forced labors, and forced marriages. In 2003, a group of Liberian women led by activist Laima Gaboe started Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace, a nonviolent campaign that brought Muslims and Christian women together from different ethnic and class demographics to end the war, as they were tired of the treatment of women during this time. The group was effective in forcing formal talks and holding people accountable to negotiation processes, as well as mobilizing national support for the peace process. They also pressured President Charles Taylor to participate in the peace talks in Ghana, as women had staged a sit-in and refused to let parties leave until they reached a negotiation, which eventually led to the 2003 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. During this time, Liberian women led a nationwide voter and civic education campaign, which led to public trust and participation in the political process. Additionally, Liberia experienced the first female head of state, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which led to higher female representation in the security sector, as the police force adopted a 20% quota for women in the police and armed forces and established recruiting and training programs to expand the pool of women qualified to serve. Liberia shows an example of the persistence of females to reach a peace negotiation and encourage political leaders to take accountability in these peace processes. Liberia is also an example of increased female participation in the security sector and police forces, showing an actual shift in societal norms among the country. Another example of women in peace is the Philippines, 2014. There had been armed conflict for decades between the government and the Moro rebel factions, starting in 1989 and not ending until 2012. Women's roles in formal and informal negotiations in the peace process led to an end of hostilities. Miriam Coronel Ferrer was the first woman chief negotiator in history to sign a major peace accord and led the Philippines government team in peace negotiations. Women were encouraged to hold meaningful negotiation teams of both parties involved in the conflict due to the Philippines government's support for the UNSCR 1325. Women included opinions from different groups and options for negotiations, as well as speaking to the public and leading extensive national consultations between religious and indigenous people and youth. Moro women were showed to be better able than men to preserve inter-ethnic alliances and led to communication and provided information about threats of violence to the peace process. The agreement recognized women's contributions to transitional governance and included women's roles in new institutional bodies and promoted women's economic participation as a pillar for broader national strategy for growth. the Philippines shows a direct initiative to include female on a broader spectrum in political and economic and social reform. Military organizations are effective when they are able to perform the tasks that their political leadership asks of them, which is typically meant fighting and winning wars. As the military has increased racial integration, gender integration is seen not only to be possible, but increasingly valuable. It has been concluded that adding women to combat units and a gender perspective to military operations more generally has the potential to add new capabilities and thereby also improve the effectiveness of operations. Examples of this include the number of women physically fit for military service allows for the maximization of the size of military forces. Also, transforming military paradigm by including an increased understanding of the importance of non-traditional security issues, such as structural violence. Gendered dimensions of conflict can be tremendously transformative by affecting what the operation does and how it does it, including the priorities and tactics. Women can provide specific competencies and perspectives that improve the conduct of operations, such as increasing information gathering and analysis capability units by gaining access to local women to develop better understanding of local conditions and culture, as well as improving units' relationships with the community. In conclusion, it's important to look at where women, peace, and security is now, which is best exemplified by a statement by the UN. The UN rightly emphasizes that female soldiers and gender perspectives are absolutely essential for certain tasks and peace operations where military and civilian aims and tasks overlap. As an example, they help address specific needs of female ex-combatants during the process of demobilization and reintegration into civilian life. They can interview survivors of gender-based violence, mentor female cadets at police and military academies, and as highlighted above, they can interact with women in societies where women are prohibited from speaking to men. Moreover, female soldiers can also serve as role models in the local environment by inspiring women and girls in often male-dominated societies to push for their own rights and for participation in peace processes. While these competencies may be dismissed as unrelated to a traditional view of military fighting power, they may prove essential in the complex operations of today. With a changing world order and new and different conflict situations, there is a need for a new strategy in military operations, and this includes the participation and support of females in peace processes and post-conflict recovery.